Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about all the books that I managed to read in the month of January. So I did end up finishing 11 books this month. However, I can only share 6 of them with you today because some of those were read for a challenge video that is coming out in just a couple weeks that I'm really excited about. So let's talk about at least those 6 books that I can share with you today. But first, before we talk about those, I do have 3 DNFs to share with you all. I am being a lot pickier this year with books that I choose to finish. Basically, I'm allowing myself to DNF a lot more easily and with a lot less guilt than in the past. In the past, I hardly DNF'd books. I very much wanted to finish everything I was reading, but that resulted in a lot of 3-star books, 2-star books, books that I just wish I had kind of passed on and spent that time reading something I was truly loving. When I DNF a book, it is not necessarily because it's a bad book or anything like that. It's just because I am not 100% invested in that book. So let's talk about those in chronological order. The first book that I did DNF this month was A Psalm of Storms and Silence by Roseanne A. Brown, which was the sequel to A Song of Wraiths and Ruin. I read the first book in this duology a couple years ago, and I had a lot of fun with it. It wasn't a new favorite, but I really liked the characters and some of the plot. With not loving the first book, I went into the second book hoping that it would improve upon a lot of the stuff that I didn't love about the first book, such as some of the world building. I just wanted a little bit more development, some of the magic, and unfortunately with the second book, it was interesting because I started it and it felt like a completely different book from the first one. Like, our characters are in very, very different places, which makes a lot of sense considering the ending of the first book, but they were in places where I wasn't super invested in where they were going, and it just wasn't capturing me in any sort of way. So I did decide to DNF this one around 20%. The pacing, it was pretty darn slow, and I just felt very disconnected, especially it feeling like a completely different book and the characters were acting very, very differently. I liked the first one for what it was, but decided I didn't have to finish off this duology. I have seen mixed reviews about the second book, but I still highly recommend checking out, especially that first book. Just finding myself not enjoying YA fantasy as much anymore as much as I used to. The next book I DNF'd was The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This one is, again, me learning a lot about myself as a reader. So I used to be the type of reader who would find an author that they really, really loved and want to check out every book by that author. No matter what the book was about, I was going to pick it up because I had these authors in my head that I just would automatically buy anything. I think I'm not going to do that anymore because this particular book, even though I've loved 2 other Grady Hendrix novels that I've read, one of them being one of my favorites of all time, I did not necessarily find myself super drawn to the premise of the Final Girl Support Group. I don't love slashers in either movie or book form, so for me, I wasn't super drawn to the premise of this, but I picked it up anyway just because it was Grady Hendrix. And quickly I realized as I was reading through it that a lot of the references that were being made I didn't get because I don't watch slasher movies, and I was not liking the main character really at all. Did not care about kind of the plot or the direction that this was going in, and this is very subjective because I've seen a lot of people love this book. And then the final book that I DNF'd is actually quite a surprise to me. It was Scarlett by Stephen R. Lawhead, which is the second book in the King Raven trilogy. I really enjoyed Hood. I found that I could not put that book down once I had started it. I really liked the writing. I really liked the politics of it. The villain was fantastic. The problem is that Scarlett is told from a completely new character's perspective. Will Scarlett is our main character in this book, and so we're seeing the entirety of the plot unfold through his eyes. And he was not a character that I necessarily found myself super drawn to, and learning the story through his eyes was something I was not expecting since he wasn't in the first book, and I didn't really love that. It didn't feel like it was the same series by doing that, so I wasn't connecting at all to Will Scarlett, and I found myself just caring less and less as I read further on. Again, I'm being really strict with which books I decide to continue on with, which series especially I decide to continue on with. I'm being a lot more strict than I used to be, and I think the old Jessie would have definitely finished this book and probably given it around a 3.5 star maybe, depending on how the rest of the book went. But I'm finding that I'm having less trouble putting these books down and moving on to something else that really does intrigue me a lot more. So enough of the DNFs, let's talk about the books that I actually did manage to finish this month, starting with the first book I finished this year, which was The Push by Ashley Audrain. This one is a psychological thriller that is all about motherhood, and it is dark and twisted and disturbing and gruesome in some parts, and I couldn't look away. I found myself being shocked by how much I was enjoying this. I don't know that I could say it was fun to read, but it was definitely something that kept me engaged the entire time. I felt like the author so perfectly captured some of the main character's emotions in this book, and the way she explored the themes of motherhood was absolutely fascinating. This one is really, really dark though, so make sure to check for the content and trigger warnings before you go into it. It hits deep and hard, but it's just one of those books that you can't look away from. It was good from start to finish, and I gave it 4.5 stars. I will definitely be checking out anything else that this author does write in the future. The next book I finished was Bring Me Back by B.A. Paris, which is my third novel that I've read by this author, and this one was so good. I love Behind Closed Doors by this author and then didn't enjoy The Breakdown. Bring Me Back was fantastic. It's about a husband whose wife goes missing and she's presumed dead after missing for so many years, but then things start appearing that make him believe that his wife may not be dead, and it's just so intriguing. And it's one of those books where when you get to the end and you figure out what's been happening, you're like, how did I not guess that? Like, I should have been able to predict this book, and I didn't. And if you're a seasoned thriller reader who is really good at predicting twists, you may predict this book from page 1, but I did not, because I'm the worst at that. I thought it was great. There were a couple times where it got repetitive, but overall I had such a good time while I was reading this. It definitely is one that I will be recommending in the future. It's just like a really fast-paced, twisty kind of novel, and I gave it 4 stars. Very, very good. It restored my faith in this author. The next book I finished was Runaway by Harlan Coben. This just took me by complete surprise. It was one of the rare books where when I started it from page 1, I could not put it down. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I finished it in 2 days because I couldn't stop. I just had to know. This is about a family whose the oldest daughter becomes a runaway and becomes a drug addict, and the father is trying to save his child and find her, and gets caught up in this greater conspiracy plot. And it is just the threads that the author wove throughout this whole book and how he connected everything at the end, and I was just like so lost throughout the whole book and was like, what the heck is going on? And I had to know what was going on. And fantastic from start to finish. I could really feel the emotions of the parents and what they were going through, and just the tension, and I was on the edge of my seat. Fantastic thriller. I will read anything this author writes. I'm going through his whole backlist now and going to check out everything. Oh my God, 5 stars. Oh, my favorite of the ones I share today. This was incredible. Oh, cannot recommend enough. The next book I finished was Killing Floor by Lee Child, which is the first book in the Jack Reacher series. And I ended up liking this. I thought it was pretty good. I really like Jack Reacher as a character. I can see why he is such a popular character and why there are so many books in this series. I can totally get it. And I really liked the mystery that we were trying to solve. It did get pretty gruesome, not gonna lie. Some of the stuff that was described was absolutely disgusting and disturbing. So know that going into it, it is not an easy read. But I really liked the mystery and how it was kind of solved and how all the dots were connected. I really liked it. I did think it was just a tad bit too long. There were a lot of times where I felt like it just kind of dragged. So it felt like it was a little bit too long to tell the story it was telling. And overall, like, I had fun with this. Will I continue the series? Probably not. But I'm really, really glad I read this first book because I get it now. I get why people love Jack Reacher. So happy I read it. I gave it 3.5 stars. The next book I read was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This one was the classic that I really wanted to read this past month, and I actually ended up reading it out loud to my daughter, which ended up taking a really long time because she's 8 months old and does not have the attention span to listen to me reading for a very long time. So it took me a while to finish it. But I found that because I read it out loud to her, I think I enjoyed it a lot more for that reason. I think if I were just like physically reading this to myself, I don't know that I would have enjoyed it as much, but reading it out loud made it really, really fun and whimsical and like doing all the different voices for her and stuff like that. So overall, like, I'm really glad I read this book. I had a lot of fun with just the nonsense and the whimsy of it. I could definitely see a lot of the scenes that were from the original Disney cartoon. I loved seeing them play out in the original book. I thought it was just a lot of fun. I'm really, really glad I ended up reading it. I probably will read Through the Looking Glass because I found Lewis Carroll's writing very easy to read, even though it was nonsensical. Your mileage will vary with how much you can kind of tolerate the nonsense of the story, especially if you do have someone you can read it out loud to. That was a really fun way to experience it. So I ended up giving it 4 stars. I don't know if I would have given it that if I hadn't read it out loud though, if that makes sense. And then the last book I have is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. This was another modern classic that I wanted to read this year, and I ended up kind of buddy reading it with my husband. And he liked it a lot more than me, but he's a lot more, how do I say, like cerebral of a reader. He really likes dissecting the text and studying it and analyzing like the deeper meanings and themes. I am not that cerebral of a reader where I have fun with that part of my reading. I read mostly to escape, so this was not my cup of tea, if you will. I can see why it's a modern classic. I really did like the themes it was exploring, but the way it's told is just very disjointed, and it was very confusing to read because of that. If you don't know, the book follows a character who was a prisoner of war during World War II, and you kind of get the story in this jumbled timeline where you're constantly jumping in time to the future, the present, and the past. And that's very purposefully done. I just didn't love it. And that's just me wanting a very basic, straightforward narrative. I'm a very basic reader. I've said this in multiple videos. You all know this about me. I'm super basic, and this is just not my personal cup of tea. However, there were times where I was like, oh my God, like that quote or this paragraph is so poignant and powerful, and I love that. So there were times where I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, but the overall reading experience was not one that I necessarily enjoyed, if that makes sense. So I gave this 3 stars because I could see like those flashes of brilliance in it, and I can appreciate what that author was doing with the text, but it just wasn't an enjoyable reading experience. So that is Slaughterhouse 5. So those were some of the books that I read in January that I can share with you today. Did you see any that you've read before, and what did you think of them? And what was your favorite read in January? I would love to know. So leave those comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.